morning. Good morning. Happy to be with you today. As Leah said, the title of this session is Qualifiers That Matter and Those That Don't. In this session, we'll discuss research on the relationship between education preparation programs, acceptance criteria, and educator effectiveness. We'll also invite you into a conversation about how North Carolina can reimagine entry criteria so that a qualified and diverse pool of applicants can enter our state's teacher pipeline. We're excited to have Chad Aldeman with us today to kick off this important topic. Chad is a senior associate partner at Bellwether Education Partners, where he has worked on the policy and evaluation team since 2012, advising clients and writing on teacher preparation, teacher evaluation, and college and career readiness. He also serves as editor for teacherpensions.org. Previously, Chad was a policy advisor in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education, where he worked on elementary and secondary education at waivers, teacher preparation, and the Teacher Incentive Fund. His work has been featured in the Washington Post, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Before I turn the floor over to Chad, I'll ask you to think about your questions during his session, and at the end we'll have time for question and answer. You can start sharing those in the chat function, and then we can move to that after his presentation. So Chad, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks all for being here. Sorry I can't be there in person. I was just saying how much I love North Carolina, and I would love to spend more time in the state. So as Sean said, I work at a nonprofit called Bellwether Education Partners, and we are a nonprofit devoted to improving the lives of underserved students. We touch on a range of topics, and the bulk of my presentation today is in a paper that we did on teacher preparation. We called it No Guarantees, and that was sort of a good metaphor for us. It captured what we heard and saw in the research, and it might be a useful metaphor for you all as well. Let me see if I can change the screen here. There we go, okay. So I think everyone here is agreement on the first one, that we want to diversify and improve teacher training to get a robust, high quality, diverse teacher workforce. What I'm going to posit today is that we don't actually know that much about how to train teachers well or effectively. And there's been a lot of talk of trying to raise the bar on the teaching profession. And what I'm going to argue and show some data on is that we actually don't know whether that is a good idea. It can lead to some false negatives, meaning we let people out who probably should be good and can be good teachers. And it also leads to false positives. If we treat academic quality as a screen or a barrier, then we might not identify the best teachers who are going to be successful in the profession. And then even if we did know an exact recipe for what worked in teacher training, we'd still have an implementation challenge given the spread and disparity across the state. And then the last point is something that is sort of a breadcrumb for you all, which is that we know much more about teachers after they become teachers than before they enter the profession. So all of the pre-service work, everything we know about a candidate is not nearly as good as what we can tell about someone after they've started teaching in the first year or two. All right, so in theory, effective preparation is a function of 4 inputs. We admit candidates into a preparation program, we provide them coursework while they're in the program, and then they become licensed and have maybe some in-service training. These barriers taken together are designed to ensure that the best candidates and only the best candidates end up in front of students. I'm going to walk through these different elements in a little bit here. So I'll start with program level inputs. I should say that I have resources at the back. I didn't put them on the slides themselves, but if you get the slides, you can find all of my resources and links to the studies that I'm quoting here. Some of them are in my the paper that I mentioned that Bellwether published, and then I added some others as well. The first thing is on coursework. We don't actually have evidence that longer preparation programs necessarily are better preparation programs. And even the content of those preparation programs and the subject and courses that students take are not linked as well. So things like even content on math or English, sometimes skill-based classes on classroom management or child development also aren't necessarily linked to improving student outcomes. If you look at it in a binary way, whether some preparation is better than nothing or some student teaching coursework is better than none, obviously the some is better than none, but there's gradations, and the gray leads to some fuzziness that it's hard to say that a certain amount is the right for every student. Even for licensure status, uncertified teachers generally are a little bit less effective, although there have been some studies that found that almost no difference between how people come into the profession and how effective they are once they become teachers. And the traditional prep versus alternative route distinction is really unhelpful, partly because some programs within your state even will offer multiple types, so they'll offer a traditional and an alternative. And there's an IES study a couple of years ago that found that there's just wide overlap between those types of programs. And so the required hours they offer, the candidates and the teachers who are actually teaching the candidates are very similar. And so it's very hard to predict, based solely on certification, how well a teacher is going to do once they become fully licensed teachers. And then even in service, we have some evidence that in-service teacher preparation, professional development is not that effective either. There's a randomized control studies conducted by the Institute for Education Sciences that found that high quality professional development in reading, math, and science all led to changes in teacher practice, but they didn't translate into student outcomes. And so even ones that were very intense, that took a long time, still didn't produce outcomes. And the other option we could have would be to look at a provider level to see whether some providers are doing a better job than other providers. Unfortunately, there's been some research suggesting that any changes or evidence we find of differences are often driven by either small sample sizes or statistical noise. This graph is from Texas, and each vertical line is one program. And the sort of spread of the program is the highest and lowest performers that are coming out of that program. And what it shows is that there's incredible overlap between programs. And so even if you drew a red bar to say, we're going to license all of these preparation programs to provide teachers to our schools, there's incredible differences, and the ones that we cut off on the left are not necessarily any different, and we might be losing some higher performers than we would. And if you try to move that bar to the right to say, well, let's just hold a higher bar, you might be screening out some people who would be good teachers anyway. And the reality is that there are far larger differences within programs than between them. I apologize, this is a little bit hard to read, but this is from a paper looking at North Carolina. And what they found was that there's wide overlap between different types of programs. And so this one is looking at each solid line is for in-state prepared teachers. The dotted lines are out-of-state prepared teachers. And in general, if you look really closely and squint, you can see that the average for the in-state prepared is slightly higher than the out-of-state prepared in terms of effectiveness once they become teachers. And but the differences are pretty small in the average, and there's wide overlap on each of these subject areas. So it's not easy to say, well, all in-state prepared teachers are better than out-of-state prepared teachers by any means. And this paper replicated this for in-state versus out-of-state, traditional versus alternative, TFA versus other types of programs. And so these types of, I think the biggest takeaway is that there are much larger differences within programs than between them. So what if we said, let's look at candidate level requirements? Candidate level requirements are slightly better predictors of effectiveness. Things like a candidate's GPA or SAT or the selectivity of the institution they attended do have some predictive power for whether they're going to be good teachers, but they only explain a very tiny portion of variation. And individuals, we all know people with strong test scores that may not be the best teachers, and vice versa. Someone who doesn't score as well on things like the SAT may be a good teacher, or good at explaining something, or just have a rapport. Candidate level measures also suffer from false negatives or false positives. You might call this type 1 or type 2 errors. This graph is looking at the Praxis 2 scores versus teacher effectiveness. I believe this is from a different southern state, but it's similar. We've seen similar patterns in other states. And what the blob is meant to show is that there's really no clear distinction of where you wanted to draw the line. So imagine drawing a vertical line to say, here's where someone can become a teacher, and here's where they cannot. So if they're on the left side, they cannot become a teacher. If they're on the right side, they can become a teacher. And the point of this graph is just to show that it's very difficult to know where to draw that line. If you draw it too far to the right, then you might exclude a lot of people who become good candidates. You might not get as many people as you want to. So there's this hard distinction of how to make that work. I will say that if you are a district trying to hire someone, there is a slight correlation between your candidates' test scores and their effectiveness. And so all things being equal, maybe you'd want to pick someone with a higher test score. But that is more for the district hiring than it is for practical for a policymaker. The last point I'd make on this slide is about diversity. So if we raise the bar on tests like Praxis 2, it has diversity implications. And nationally, I guess I misspelled something there, but nationally, Black candidates have Praxis 2 passing rates that are 30 to 40% lower than white candidates. That doesn't mean they are better or worse teachers. In fact, there's lots of evidence from North Carolina that suggests that Black teachers have a better rapport and get better results from Black students. Particularly that race match matters a lot. And so there are different implications for how we think about raising the bar on teachers. All right, so let's say we knew the exact recipe of candidate and program level barriers that we could put in place. How would we implement them? And this is a little bit of a new point, I think, for some people to understand the disparities, not disparities, more like spread of how candidates come into the teaching profession. I apologize, they're choosing to mow my lawn right now, so hopefully you can all hear me. So these are Title II data that North Carolina reported to the federal government. As of 2019, North Carolina had 73 preparation program providers. Like I said before, there are some of institutions that have a traditional and alternative route providers, and so that would be captured in the total there. But they offered 765 total programs, which recommended candidates for 4,611 licenses, which is an average of 4.8 licenses per program, which is not very many. It also means that some of them are very, very small, or some are non-existent in some years. So only 5 programs in North Carolina in 2019 recommended for licensure more than 50 completers. And there were 354 programs that had more than 1 but less than 20 completers in that year. So they're just a small, sort of a big spread of how you think about the number of providers. The other thing I will say is that there aren't tight linkages necessarily between preparation programs and school districts. And so there's some good data in North Carolina of where teachers come from in various districts, and districts tend to hire. They do have some partnerships, there's some regionality to it, But in general, they hire people from all over the state that are trained all over the state, and vice versa. Preparation programs tend to send their candidates all across the state. It might be good for individuals, but it means that there are not necessarily tight linkages between a district and a preparation program. All right, so the breadcrumb I promised to leave you with is some results suggesting that early career performance is much more predictive of future performance than all the other things we know about someone before they come into the profession. So this graph is looking at value added. The next slide I'm going to show you is looking at teacher principal evaluation ratings. But what they show is that someone who comes in and is already performing pretty well tends to stay pretty high. If you are a teacher and you come in and you struggle, you might get better, but you still might not catch up on average with your higher performing peers. And so that's what this is showing, is if you break teachers into early career quintiles based on how they perform compared to their peers, those quintiles stay pretty constant. They do come together a little bit, but they don't come together fully. And there's everyone knows that teachers get better rapidly in their first few years, but there's a wide disparity in how that performance plays out. And here's the same for teacher observation ratings from their principals. The sort of yellow dash line is for teachers who are rated in the 25th percentile early on. The solid line is for teachers who are rated higher. And what it shows is that there's the same pattern shows up in both value-added scores as well as principal observation ratings. All right, so I'm going to summarize a few lessons for you all to take away. One is that the past teaching performance is the best predictor for future teaching performance. And that is an important thing, and it might sound obvious or dumb, but it does mean that all of the things that we're trying to measure about someone before they become a teacher is not nearly as effective as looking at how they actually perform once they're in that situation. I would argue that we should eliminate barriers that don't have a strong link to actual teaching performance. And so rather than put those in place based on logic or theory, we should evaluate them first. And if they don't have that link, or if we look backwards and find the things that are taking people away from becoming teachers that aren't necessarily predictive of whether they'll be good teachers, are not the best barriers to have in place. From that, I think we should make it less risky to try teaching, perhaps through something like an apprenticeship model where someone with some base level credentials can get into a teaching program and start trying to become teachers and working towards that and being evaluated, being trained in that setting that is more on the job than trying to give them training before they enter the classroom. I also think that we should allow schools and districts, especially high-performing ones, to select, train, and license their own teachers. If we don't have that much confidence in all of the candidate level or program level in terms of licensure, then we should allow districts to make those decisions about who they recruit and how they train them. And the last thing is that there's quite a bit of evidence that how we train people in terms of where they are paired and who they are paired with do matter. And so things like teacher mentorships matter quite a bit, and pairing candidates with higher performing mentors does lead them to become better teachers once they enter the classroom. And so using that as a tool for improving outcomes going forward, I think is an important lever for you all to think about in North Carolina. All right, I will stop. As I mentioned, the slide references are all back here, and hopefully we can share those with you. But I will stop there.
Thank you, Chad. Some really good conversation happening in the chat, but definitely please add your questions. I will say, this is a very important topic for the UNC system and our Board of Governors. We are the largest source of teachers for North Carolina, so it is our responsibility to do our part to ensure a well-qualified and diverse teacher pipeline. In 2017, the system office commissioned an examination of teacher preparation. And the researchers found several opportunities for improvement for us and several ways that we could better support our EPP leaders and our faculty. And one of those recommendations included creating an educator preparation advisory group to address the recommendations from that report. My colleague Laura Bellwether is on the call today, and she's leading that work, so I'll leave the hard questions to her. But that group has met several times since the release of that report, and they've set goals for this work. They have several goals, but one of the most relevant to this conversation is to recruit, select, and support a highly qualified pool of teacher candidates and beginning teachers that closely reflects the demographics of our public schools. They are currently setting metrics to measure progress on this goal, and still, like I said, developing those metrics, but we'll look at application and admission rates disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and gender, completion rates, retention in the classroom 2 years post-graduation overall, and by gender, race, and ethnicity. We'll also consider the number of graduates receiving initial licenses in hard-to-staff subject areas, job placement rates by licensure area, and the number of graduates employed and retained in high poverty and low performing schools. We're also striving to build and strengthen strategic partnerships between our EPPs and their public school partners. And so we have the beginnings of a plan, but we don't pretend to have it all figured out. We know that there's more work to be done, and we're learning from all the hard work that's happening across our system in our state, and from conversations like the ones we're having this week through the Innovation Lab, and not to mention the type of research and policy analysis that Chad's doing. So thank you for this conversation. I see that there are some questions, and so I'll start with the first one that I see. For you, Chad, are we aware of any similar analysis for professional preparation programs in other sectors to see what the significant distinguishers might or might not exist? So for example, medicine, law, or engineering.
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think that teacher preparation has been more studied in that regard than other programs. Medicine is more like an apprenticeship model in lots of ways. There's a body of work on science, and then they get a clinical experience, if you will, for developing that, and then they move into the profession that way. Law, I'll be honest, I don't think anyone believes that necessarily law school or even the bar exam are good predictors of who will be an effective lawyer. I just don't think they care about that as much, partly because it's not in the public space. It's more like a screening for a profession than it is for improving a public service. And so I think that is a distinction that's important. Yeah, so that's the main takeaway I would say from that. The other thing I would say is there's been other parallels to things like there's a great piece by Malcolm Gladwell comparing teachers to NFL quarterbacks, and I find it a useful metaphor here. The things that people do in college may not necessarily predict who's going to be a great quarterback. I think it's similar to here in teaching, when the people who do well in a college preparation program are not always going to do well as teachers, and vice versa.
Do you know of any work around creating profiles of successful teachers so we can look for patterns? Yeah.
That's a good question. So there are things like Teach for America and TNTP have worked on this. Teach for America, there's a study suggesting that some of their candidate level assessments of things like grit and belief in students and efficacy and their power to sort of change directions of patterns that they want to see in the world do matter somewhat. TNTP has sort of tried this, and what they've concluded is that, similar to what I've shared here, is that all the screens that they did on candidates before they entered their program were not that predictive, and they really needed to see someone teach. That is an important lesson, is that there are other studies suggesting that actual teaching is predictive. So even if it's not being a teacher, if there are things like student teaching experience and students practice a lesson, having them record that lesson and then sharing that with future employers could be a way for employers to get a sense of how teachers are in the classroom. Or having practice lessons are often more predictive than things like a GPA or something else like that.
Great. As I mentioned, the system office, part of our goals, one of our goals is to strengthen partnerships. And so there is a question about, have you looked at models where EPPs and LEAs partner together to help develop effective teachers?
Yeah, I think of things, so there aren't many states that are going in the full direction of what I'm discussing here. I would think of models like the opportunity culture in North Carolina, the TAP model that's spread across the country in terms of it's more of a program to help teachers develop and to have schools led by high quality teachers and to have them be master or mentor teachers. I think those are important levers. Kevin mentioned in the chat that some of the best research suggests that how we think about pairing up new candidates with experienced veteran professionals is an important lever that we haven't really fully seized on.
Great, and we have a question from Kevin. You focused on effectiveness, and he says that's totally reasonable, but can you speak to teacher retention differences based on preparation? He says that is important to consider given high rates of turnover occur in certain types of schools and often necessitate more early career teachers to be hired there.
Yeah, so the literature on this suggests that alternative route providers candidates who come from alternative route providers tend to have higher turnover rates than candidates who come from traditional route providers, particularly for something like TNTP, which has a 2-year commitment. What I have not seen much research on what is driving that and whether it's the program itself that's driving it, or if it's something about the actual recruitment into those programs. I actually suspect it's mostly the latter, and the types of candidates who prefer the alternative route are more likely to try out teaching and not see it as a full career option, whereas someone who goes through traditional is more likely to think of teaching as something they definitely want to do for their career. So I don't want to say that it's necessarily one or the other. I haven't seen much on how to boost retention from a program side. I think there are things we know about how to boost retention from a school side. It's things like school climate and culture and professional development opportunities and pay. I think those are all things that really matter, and are probably as effective or more effective than focusing on the preparation side.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. Given that teacher preparation is integrated into a complex tapestry of policy, how can various teacher prep programs leverage and promote innovation while also addressing accountability and accreditation standards?
That's a good question. So I think there's a lot of research that can be done. I think we have not set up a good mechanism for doing those things about what actually matters. And I think establishing those sort of research practice partnerships to try different things and then evaluate whether they're working or not are the sort of future that I'd like to see. And someone in the chat, and in fact, we've been criticized for our paper of well, this is just warm bodies for America, you letting anyone into the profession. And I don't think that's quite the way I would describe it. I think I would still set some basic parameters about who can be a teacher, but then also be much more serious and intentful about who gets a fully license, who can stay in the profession, and using it that way, I think is the direction I would like to see. There's a lot more we could know about how to teach reading effectively, for example, or how to help boost retention rates in early career professionals. I think those are the types of things that I would like to see going forward.
Great. Leah, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, I think so. I've seen a lot of questions come up, so maybe maybe one or two. Well, let's try to go to maybe 10:05.
Okay, great. So do we have any data on the teacher effectiveness of candidates who enter a college of education with high levels of pre-college teaching exposure under their belts, such as high school internships, presumably experiences that might be formative early in their career?
We don't really have much evidence on that. I would say that generally there's probably linkages to retention that I mentioned earlier. So someone who's tried teaching, that wants to stay in teaching and is committed to teaching, is probably more likely to stay after they've already gone through that. On the research side, we know that there's not really any indicator that the amount of clinical experience necessarily dictates whether someone's going to be a better teacher. I do think those opportunities, getting people in front of students earlier in sort of low stakes way, whether that's summer school or tutoring, is a good way to test them out as candidates, but also give the candidates exposure to what actually is demanded of them to be a leader in a classroom of children. I think those are good opportunities for both sides to experiment and to learn how that would work for them.
Great. All right. I'm not sure I see any other questions. There's some really good comments in the chat, but I think those are all the questions for you, Chad. So thank you. Any final words or wisdom to leave with the group?
I don't think so. I think some of this is a little bit scary. So to the warm bodies for America comment, I've been criticized for that, and people say, well, it deprofessionalized the teaching profession. And there's some truth to that, but I would say my rebuttal would be we should professionalize and make the teaching profession better based on how we pay teachers, how we train them once they're there, and what it takes to actually be an effective teacher, and making sure that we have high quality people in the schools, rather than trying to set up a barrier at the outset when we don't know as much.